Good day, everyone! London Onion here, returning with a new build for a previously visited archetype, that being the Engineer. Accompanying today will be the Handler with our favorite doggo companion, Rufus. First, we'll have a thorough exposition of the build, then apply it to our archetype matrix, and discuss application and limitations with an assessment on boss efficacy. Let's get started. So the armor is not necessarily prescriptive, but I go with a mixture of the Radiant and Leto Mark II armor sets, Radiant Visage and Body Armor, and the Leto Mark II leggings and gloves. The main idea is to get as close to 75 armor units as possible while maximizing elemental resistances. The relic is also up to preference, though this onion would argue that either the Shielded Heart, Void Heart, or Unsullied Heart are one's best options for this build. For the sake of demonstration, I went with the Void Heart. The shards I equip are Armor Effectiveness, Shield Effectiveness, and Mod/Skill Casting Speed. Moving on to the weapons, I equip the Bonesaw LMG for our primary, with the Song of Aether mod and the Bottom Heavy Mutator for a boost in reload speed and fire rate. As for the secondary, I equip either the Repeater Pistol or the Service Pistol. Both fulfill the same purpose commensurately, but differently. Both are efficient in ammo expenditure and reloading. The Service Pistol has greater burst damage with a lower magazine, while the Repeater Pistol has lower burst damage but a greater magazine. The choice is really yours, though this onion prefers the Service Pistol. I employ the Scrapshot mod and Kill Switch Mutator. Now the melee weapon is important, but technically not a necessity. I equip the Dreamcatcher melee weapon with latency to take more frequent advantage of its charged ability. Transitioning to the gorgeous jewelry, the amulet leading this build is the Detonation Trigger, which increases explosion damage by 25%. Explosions will also apply burning damage over 5 seconds. As for the rings, I apply Timekeeper's Jewel, Closed Loop, Generating Band, and Ring of Ordnance. Timekeeper's Jewel increases the duration of all status effects applied by the wearer. This will buff the base burning damage duration of Detonation Trigger to 10 seconds for a total of 930 damage over 10 seconds. Closed Loop grants a 5% shield for 10 seconds following a charged shot, and maximizes at 25%. Generating Band grants 3% of one's health per second while a shield is active. Lastly, Ring of Ordnance allows one's heavy weapon to replenish ammo over time, both in carry and turret mode. Replenishment is doubled when stowed away. To briefly discuss our skills, on the Engineer side, I guess this can go without saying, I keep the heavy weapon on the impact cannon setting. As for Rufus, I keep him in Guard Dog mode. Placing the cherry on top of this build, I steal the Summoner's Regrowth and the Invader's Untouchable. Then Vigor, Endurance, Amplitude, Bark Skin, Fitness, Recovery, and Shade Skin. With the build ascertained, we will move on to our build designation. So for those who were present for our previous build, I had introduced my arbitrary prototype archetype matrix to help illustrate the main function of a given build. The left and right vertices act as poles of measurement for the dominant combat method, while the north and south poles are modifiers. Lastly, the lines act as ranked designative traits that are present to varying degrees. For the purpose of consistency, Predators will be defined as close quarters and/or melee-oriented builds with a reactive, blitzkrieg-like answer to enemy encounters. Tacticians will be defined as range-oriented builds with a proactive attritional answer to enemy encounters. Specialized builds refine the main offensive method for optimized carnage and execution. Naturally, such builds are narrow in attack pattern and may struggle in a number of circumstances that aren't conducive to the highlighted offensive method. However, they are unparalleled when successfully executed. Dynamic builds diversify offensive/defensive avenues for having an answer to a wide range of enemies/circumstances. Such builds may give way to overly convoluted/segmented operation, or inhibited offense due to a lack of simplified capitalization, but will rarely be left without an effective answer. To determine the designation, we'll look at our evaluation of function. Starting with offensive capability, highest on the tier list is highest and most frequent damage numbers. This is most easily attributed to the heavy weapon when in carry mode. And in this Onion's opinion, the impact cannon is a burst damage weapon, optimally used for mid to far range. The fire rate won't come near the bone saw or pistol, but the damage over time will remain superior. And this will give significant weight to the tactician pull towards the cannon line. Though to be fair, burst damage potential is not the deciding factor for our designation, but simply a correlation. As for ease of execution, the primary and secondary weapons are inherently easier to use than the heavy weapon, as it is a charged weapon, taking approximately 1 second, meaning that there is a demand on timing and a fair amount of range for safety. The round itself does not cover a wide range, however it can be dodge cancelled, and the point of impact has an explosive radius, which can balance out the ease of use. Practicality or applicability is also balanced. The heavy weapon in carry mode will have more or less difficulty depending on the volume and proximity of enemies. It is most ideal against elites, fewer numbers, or close-knit targets of any profile. One's regular weapons may seem more practical, but already fall short on their offensive capability, meaning that there will be far more time spent per target. This can only change if the heavy weapon is placed in turret mode. Then one's ranged weapons will take the lead with most frequent damage numbers and superior damage over time, depending on the number of targets in range. The melee weapon takes a back seat on this entire spectrum, though as an honorable mention, melee use with the heavy weapon packs a hard punch, but this Onion would argue that the ease of use and practicality are not up to par, which will reduce weight toward the Predator side. Moving on to restorative/defensive capability, for health regeneration, this comes from the regrowth trait, our relic, and generating band. The first two are neutral. Generating band, however, is activated by closed loop, which in turn is activated from impact cannon rounds. This puts both health and shield generation toward the impact cannon, which we had already determined to be weighing towards the cannon line on the tactician pole. Damage reduction is not a dimension that plays to either specific pole in this build, so restorative and defensive capability weigh into the tactician side. Lastly, build synergy refers to compounding effects and the intended purpose behind build constituents. This goes without saying, but amulet and ring enhancements are mainly tailored to the impact cannon. Otherwise, Kill Switch on the service pistol benefits from the amulet and timekeeper's jewel, giving a small amount of weight to the kiter line. As for skill enhancements, the impact cannon skill, if you will, is the main tool for this build, so 1/2 of this build is easy to determine. One useful enhancement is automatic firearm ammo replenishment when in close proximity with the impact cannon. This will allow greater firearm readiness and more frequent applicability, which does add some dynamism, giving some weight to the kiter line. As for the use of Rufus, he primarily functions as a decoy, which is intended to allow greater applicability of our impact cannon, since enemies will likely spend more time chasing our doggo than focusing on us. However, this strategy can also be applied while the heavy weapon is in turret mode, and allow the handler side to more accurately direct Rufus's attention. Additionally, he will target enemies that get too close, in the event a given player is unaware, and act as a protective bastion. And as for our relic shards, armor effectiveness is generally useful and therefore neutral. Shield effectiveness compounds with closed loop and generating band, and casting speed only adds grease to the skill activation process. So this Onion would primarily designate our Howling Howitzer as a cannon, since most of the evaluative aspects encourage a niche style of combat. Cannons operate from a range, but hit particularly hard. Now, Ring of Ordnance allows one's cannon to stay in hand for an extended period of time. Putting it in turret mode opens the build up to a more dynamic operation, with the free use of mods, commanding Rufus, and more effective dodges. Due to our main weapons being devoid of enhancements, both mods and our melee weapon are intended to slow enemies at varying radii. This can compensate the likely extended time per target, or even give way to using one's cannon in hand. The Dreamcatcher, though, will enhance all damage for a period of time, and is intended to play a supplementary role to an otherwise range-based build. Additionally, one can stow away and reactivate their heavy weapon liberally, due to the fast replenishment granted by Ring of Ordnance. This comes in most useful when facing off against numerous and airborne targets. Trudging around with a cannon in hand can mean one's demise quickly. Sometimes it's easier to stow the weapon and reactivate it at a more opportune time. Dynamic play with the heavy weapon in turret mode has its place and advantages, but won't make full use of this Howling Howitzer's capabilities. For our final talking point, we'll transition to boss efficacy. Now there are 3 categories I break bosses down to. Similar to our archetype matrix, they are brawlers, sentries, and dynamos. Brawlers are melee-oriented and constantly bring the fight to you. They tend to exercise area of effect type attacks, but with varied ranged capability. They are more likely to have armored weak spots, if any at all, and devastating blows. Sentries are extremely difficult to strike directly, while the bulk, if not all, of their offense is range-based. Their vulnerability tends to have a variable state. They have a greater likelihood of minion reliance, and will force a player's attention on evasion over offense, or what this onion will call a forced trial. Dynamos are a mixture of ranged and melee-based attacks. Complicated / attention-splitting fight patterns, map manipulation, and high maneuverability are primary markers of dynamos. Just like before, we'll draw 3 names from our boss hat fitting for each designation to test the efficacy of our Howling Howitzer. For today's discussion, we have the Ravager, Shahala, and Fei Lin. Starting off with the Ravager, this onion would classify this boss as a brawler. He is constantly in pursuit and bringing the fight to you. His AoE attacks are few, with 1 semi-radial wave and a wide-range vortex-like attack that tests the efficiency of one's stamina. This also overlaps with Forced Trial, typically a sentry strategy, as one will likely spend their time evading than attacking, even though he is technically vulnerable to damage. Lastly, his Howl in the final phase inflicts significant damage over a wide radius. The Ravager is also rather devastating, with knockdown capability, high insta-give potential with the wide-range AoE attacks, and can cause bleeding if sustaining a particular bite attack. Lastly, he has a dynamic effect of high maneuverability. Now the only silver lining with this beast is that he has no weak spot protection. Most of this battle can be easily done with the cannon in hand, and with his exposed weak spot, dealing significant burst damage comes easy. The only time this may change is when he summons hollows, at which point putting the heavy weapon into turret mode would be the best course of action. Rufus's Howl may also be an option so that he may take them out, but efficiency is key to making this battle simple. The untouchable trait should make dodging during this battle more efficacious. Overall, I found it to be relatively simple. Transitioning to Shahala, this was easily one of the more frustrating battles. Shahala is a textbook sentry, similar to the Custodian's Eye. He, or it, comes with heavy minion use across the spectrum. 2 out of 3 varied vulnerability traits, namely periodic weak spot availability, and an otherwise obfuscated weak spot. Shahala is also distant, specifically being out of strike range, and frequently employing forced trial tactics where one has to worry more about dodging lasers, portals with giant fists, and miniature black holes. As a cherry on top, it has a dynamic trait of complicated or attention-splitting offense. With our Howling Howitzer build, Shahala requires frequent changes in offensive strategy to optimize damage output and health maintenance. Even with the untouchable trait, holding the cannon for the entire fight is insufficient for some forced trial events. The only times holding the cannon really worked well in this onion's opinion was when Shahala was front and center or immediately following the black hole attack. All other instances were risky and left this onion open to insta-gibs, a small deviation from typical sentry traits. During forced trial events, the cannon is best left stowed away, lest it become destroyed, and one will have to rely on their main firearms to defend themselves. Rufus can help with stealing some attention from Shahala's minion attacks, but this guy will probably spend more time incapacitated if this onion's being honest. After all, he will attempt to bite anything, including a miniature black hole. Props to Rufus, but he takes a bit of a backseat in this battle. As long as one uses their cannon at the appropriate times, victory should be assured. Transitioning to our last boss, Fei Lin, a dynamo in this onion's opinion. Fei Lin has high maneuverability with frequent teleportation, map manipulation with the falling swords, and an attention-splitting attack pattern that mixes both ranged and physical attacks. This overlaps with minion use, which is frequent and varying saturation, but luckily only two slightly different varieties. In the distant spectrum, he is constantly mobile, even while vulnerable to attacks. For area of effect, he mainly employs small short-range radial waves with falling swords that become more pronounced in the final phase. Fei Lin is not particularly devastating for the most part, but this changes in his final phase, to which every attack has high insta-give potential while going through a forced trial of delayed falling swords. Now, in this Onion's assessment, dynamos tend to have a brawling or sentry edge. Fei Lin in particular has a brawling edge due to his attack patterns. Part of his dynamism is his tendency to randomly cancel one of his physical attacks and restart a new attack sequence almost instantly. To the unfamiliar, this is extremely confusing, and he will employ this throughout his first, second, and third phase. Despite his complicated attack patterns and vast changes to said attack patterns, our Howling Howitzer can perform perfectly well with the cannon in hand for the whole fight. The impact cannon's burst damage is enough to take out his ranged minions efficiently, and allow one to use the extra time to shoot uninterrupted. Familiarization with attack pattern is key in this battle, especially in the final phase where deactivating and reactivating the heavy weapon is an acceptable tactic for a higher evade window. Having the cannon in hand will offer greater survivability from damage due to shield generation. Just remember, in his final phase, the swords stop falling when he materializes to attack you. Just try not to get hit, as all of his attacks are quite devastating. Now, this boss efficacy evaluation is not intended to be exhaustive, as bosses for each category will vary, and the attributes can naturally be mixed. Some sentry bosses will have some brawler traits and vice versa, but this discussion serves as a rough blueprint for how our Howling Howitzer can fare under the circumstances that generally come with each type, using a few key examples. Now, I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses, based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. My designations of archetypes and bosses is experimental, and is consequently open to revision and criticism. As we construct and explore more builds, our categories may be subject to change or addition. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. It's been London Onion, and I will see you guys next time.